Imagine waking up tomorrow knowing that no insult, no criticism, and no disrespectful remark could shake your peace. Someone mocks your choices. A coworker questions your abilities. A stranger leaves a cruel comment online. Instead of feeling your heart race or scrambling to think of the perfect comeback hours later, you remain completely composed. Not because you've learned how to argue better, but because you've learned something far more powerful. You discover that your peace is no longer available for other people to control. Most of us spend our lives believing we need better words. We think confidence comes from having the sharpest response or the strongest argument. The Stoics believe something entirely different. They believe the strongest response often begins long before you open your mouth. It begins inside your own mind. Today, we're going to explore 7 Stoic responses that can completely transform the way you deal with criticism, disrespect, and difficult people. These aren't manipulative techniques or clever one-liners designed to embarrass someone. They are habits of thinking, ways of seeing the world that make you emotionally untouchable. By the end of this video, you'll realize that the real battle isn't against the person standing in front of you. It's against the part of yourself that believes every opinion deserves a reaction. Let's begin. Think back to the last time someone's words ruined your mood. Maybe they questioned your intelligence. Maybe they criticized something you work hard to achieve. Maybe they dismissed your dreams with a careless sentence. What happened afterward? Did the words disappear? Of course. But your mind didn't let them go. You replayed the conversation. You imagined different responses. You wondered what everyone else was thinking. Long after the other person had moved on with their day, you were still carrying the weight of a few spoken words. This is exactly what the Stoics wanted us to notice. Most suffering doesn't happen during the conversation. It happens afterward. The argument continues inside our own minds. Epictetus understood this better than almost anyone. His life was filled with hardship. Yet instead of allowing his circumstances to define him, he discovered one of the most liberating truths in philosophy. People are rarely disturbed by events themselves. They're disturbed by the meaning they attach to those events. Think about that carefully. 2 people can hear the exact same criticism. One becomes furious. The other remains completely calm. The words were identical. The experience wasn't. That means the real source of emotional pain isn't always what another person says. It's the story we immediately begin telling ourselves. They don't respect me. Everyone agrees with them. I have to defend myself. Once those thoughts take over, we've already surrendered control. The Stoics believe freedom begins the moment we recognize that our interpretation is a choice, not an automatic sentence. A choice. And once you understand that, every conversation changes. Response 1. I could be mistaken. At first, this response sounds almost dangerous. Wouldn't admitting you might be wrong make you appear weak? Not according to the Stoics. In fact, they believe the opposite. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire that stretched across continents. Every decision he made was judged by generals, politicians, philosophers, and ordinary citizens. If anyone had reason to defend his reputation at all costs, it was him. Yet he constantly reminded himself to welcome correction whenever it revealed the truth. That takes remarkable confidence. Notice the difference between confidence and pride. Pride says, I must always be right. Confidence says, if I'm wrong, I have nothing to fear from discovering it. Most arguments continue because neither person wants to lose. Both are protecting their ego instead of searching for understanding. But the moment you calmly say, I could be mistaken, everything changes. You remove the need to fight. Suddenly the conversation isn't about protecting your image. It's about discovering what's true. That shift is incredibly powerful. Imagine a coworker criticizes one of your ideas during a meeting. Instead of interrupting or becoming defensive, you respond, that's possible. Tell me what you think I'm overlooking. Now, one of 2 things happens. If they're offering genuine feedback, you've created space to learn something valuable. If they're simply trying to embarrass you, their strategy immediately begins to collapse because you refuse to play the role they expected. People who seek conflict usually depend on resistance. Without resistance, conflict loses its fuel. This doesn't mean doubting yourself constantly. It means caring more about truth than about appearing perfect. Ironically, People trust those who admit uncertainty far more than those who pretend to know everything. Real wisdom isn't threatened by correction. It grows because of it. Every insult is secretly asking one question. Can I control your emotions? Most people answer without realizing it. They become louder, more defensive, more desperate to prove themselves. And in doing so, they hand over exactly what the other person wanted, their peace. The Stoics understood that ego is incredibly fragile. It constantly searches for approval. It fears embarrassment. It wants recognition. Because of that, it's easy to manipulate. But a person who no longer needs constant validation becomes surprisingly difficult to provoke. Imagine trying to push against a wall that suddenly disappears. There's nothing left to fight. That's exactly what happens when you stop defending your ego and start protecting your character instead. One can be attacked. The other cannot. Response 2, silence. This may be the hardest response on today's list. Not because it's complicated, because it feels unnatural. When someone insults us, every instinct demands an immediate reply. Silence feels uncomfortable, almost like surrender. But Stoic silence isn't surrender. It's selection. You're deciding that not every opinion deserves access to your attention. Think about how much energy people spend arguing online. Hours disappear. Friendships are damaged. Stress increases. Yet almost nobody changes their mind. The Stoics would ask a simple question. What exactly did you gain? Sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to enter a battle that never needed to happen. Marcus Aurelius practiced this repeatedly throughout his life. As emperor, he heard endless criticism. Political rivals challenged him. Citizens questioned him. Military leaders disagreed with him. If he had reacted emotionally to every insult, he would have exhausted himself long before solving the problems that truly mattered. Instead, he developed the discipline of pausing. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he waited. Sometimes he said nothing at all. That wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, because silence has a remarkable effect. It gives you time. Time to think. Time to observe. Time to decide whether a response will improve the situation or simply satisfy your emotions. Those few seconds create the difference between reaction and mastery. Imagine someone makes a sarcastic remark about you during a family gathering. Everyone looks in your direction. They're waiting. Some expect an argument. Others expect an awkward laugh. Instead, you simply smile. You remain calm. You continue the conversation without acknowledging the insult. Something unexpected happens. The uncomfortable tension doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the person who created it. People often become embarrassed when their attempt to provoke someone receives no emotional reward. Conflict depends on participation. Without it, many arguments die before they begin. This doesn't mean remaining silent forever. Sometimes difficult conversations are necessary. Sometimes boundaries must be expressed clearly. But silence teaches us something important before every response. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every criticism deserves your energy. And not every battle deserves your participation. Here's a practical exercise to begin using today. The next time someone says something that immediately irritates you, don't answer right away. Take one slow breath. Count to 3. Ask yourself one question. Will my next sentence improve this moment? If the answer is no, silence may already be the strongest response available. Because true strength isn't measured by how quickly you speak. It's measured by how completely you control the impulse to speak. And that's where genuine freedom begins. Response 3, that's one way to look at it. Have you ever noticed how most arguments begin with one hidden assumption? Each person believes their perspective is the only reasonable one. The moment someone disagrees, both sides stop listening. Instead of trying to understand, they begin preparing their next response. This is why so many conversations go nowhere. The goal quietly shifts from discovering the truth to defending an identity. The Stoics refused to play this game. They understood that every human being views the world through a different set of experiences, beliefs, fears, and expectations. What seems obvious to you may seem completely different to someone else. Recognizing this doesn't mean every opinion is equally correct. It simply means your perspective isn't the only one that exists. That's why one of the most disarming responses you can use is, "That's one way to look at it." Notice what happens when you say those words. You aren't agreeing. You aren't disagreeing. You're acknowledging that another perspective exists without allowing yourself to become trapped inside it. This simple sentence removes the emotional charge from the conversation. Instead of creating opposition, it creates space. Space to think, space to observe, space to decide whether the discussion is even worth continuing. Imagine someone says, "You'll never succeed doing things that way." Most people immediately become defensive. They start listing achievements, explaining themselves, trying desperately to change the other person's opinion. But what if you simply smiled and replied, "That's one way to see it"? The emotional momentum disappears. The conversation loses its fuel because you refuse to make someone else's judgment your personal burden. One of the greatest freedoms in life is realizing you don't have to carry every opinion people place on your shoulders. Some opinions deserve reflection. Others deserve nothing more than quiet acknowledgement. Learning the difference is wisdom. Curiosity is stronger than defensiveness. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that people act according to what they believe is true, even when they're mistaken. Think about that for a moment. Very few people wake up hoping to become unreasonable. Most are simply acting from limited understanding, personal experiences, or emotional pain. Once you recognize this, something changes inside you. Instead of seeing disagreement as a personal attack, you begin seeing it as information. Why does this person think that way? What experiences shape their opinion? What fears might be influencing their judgment? Suddenly, curiosity replaces hostility, and curiosity is much harder to provoke. A curious mind asks questions. An insecure mind starts fights. The Stoics always encourage the first. Response 4, "Let me think about that." Modern life teaches us that quick responses are signs of intelligence. Reply immediately. Defend yourself instantly. Never hesitate. But wisdom rarely operates at the speed of emotion. The Stoics believed thoughtful pauses were signs of discipline, not weakness. Seneca developed a habit of reviewing each day before going to sleep. He reflected on his actions, his decisions, his mistakes, his progress. Why? Because time reveals things emotion often hides. The same principle applies to conversations. Imagine someone criticizes your leadership at work. Your first instinct is to explain yourself, to prove they're mistaken, to list everything you've done correctly. Instead, you calmly respond, "That's worth thinking about." Or, "Let me think about that." Those 5 simple words accomplish something remarkable. They interrupt the emotional cycle. Instead of reacting, you've chosen reflection. Whether the criticism is fair or unfair becomes almost secondary. You've demonstrated something far more valuable: self-control. People rarely expect patience, especially during disagreement. That's exactly why it's so powerful. Marcus Aurelius led one of history's largest empires. Every day he faced disputes involving politics, military decisions, justice, and countless personal disagreements. Imagine the pressure to make immediate decisions. Yet historical accounts consistently describe him as someone who listened carefully before reaching conclusions. He asked questions. He gathered information. He allowed himself time to think. His patience wasn't hesitation. It was discipline. There's a lesson here for every one of us. Not every question requires an immediate answer. Not every accusation deserves an instant defense. Sometimes your greatest strength is giving yourself permission to think before speaking. That brief pause often prevents hours, or even years, of regret. Think about the arguments you regretted most. How many began because you answered too quickly? How many could have ended differently if you had simply paused? Wisdom often arrives a few moments after emotion. The Stoics trained themselves to wait for wisdom. Response 5, "You might have a point." This response sounds similar to the first one, but there's an important difference. "I could be mistaken" is humility directed inward. "You might have a point" is generosity directed outward. It's your willingness to admit that another person may possess a piece of the truth you haven't yet considered. Notice what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean surrendering your beliefs. It doesn't mean agreeing with everything someone says. It simply means remaining open enough to learn. That openness is surprisingly rare. Most people enter conversations with their conclusions already decided. They're not listening. They're waiting for their turn to speak. The Stoics believe this attitude blocks wisdom before it has a chance to appear. Real learning requires uncertainty. If your mind is completely closed, nothing new can enter it. Imagine discussing a project with a coworker. They suggest an approach completely different from yours. Instead of immediately explaining why your idea is better, you say, "You might have a point. Let's explore that." What happens? The conversation changes. The other person feels respected. Defensiveness decreases. Collaboration becomes possible. Ironically, people become much more willing to consider your perspective after they felt heard themselves. Respect creates openness. Ego creates resistance. Winning isn't the goal. The founder of Stoicism, Zeno, believed philosophy wasn't about defeating opponents. It was about becoming wiser. That's a profound difference. Today, many conversations resemble competitions. People collect arguments like weapons. Every discussion becomes something to win. But ask yourself honestly, how many relationships have been strengthened because one person successfully proved the other wrong? Very few. The Stoics pursued something more valuable than victory. They pursued understanding. Sometimes that understanding confirmed their original beliefs. Sometimes it completely changed them. Either outcome was acceptable because truth mattered more than pride. Imagine how much calmer your life would become if every disagreement carried one simple objective. Not, how do I win? But, what can I learn here? That single question transforms every conversation, even difficult ones. Response 6. This doesn't need my energy. Notice something about the most emotionally mature people you've ever met. They don't react to everything. They choose carefully where their attention goes. Someone else may become upset over a careless remark, a sarcastic comment, or an unfair opinion. They simply observe it, consider it, then continue with their day. That isn't because they don't care. It's because they've learned something most people never do. Attention is one of life's most valuable resources. Once you give it away, you can never get that moment back. Epictetus repeatedly reminded his students that the only true freedom lies in choosing what deserves your concern. You cannot stop people from criticizing you. You cannot stop rumors. You cannot stop misunderstandings. But you can decide whether those things deserve a permanent place inside your mind. Think about how often people replay uncomfortable conversations. A single sentence spoken in the morning continues stealing their peace at lunchtime, during dinner, before bed, even days later. The other person may have forgotten the conversation completely, yet it continues living inside the mind of the one who refused to let it go. The Stoics would ask a simple question: why continue carrying what no longer exists? The conversation has ended. Only your attachment remains. Learning to release that attachment is one of the greatest forms of freedom. Imagine you're presenting an idea during an important meeting. Afterward, one colleague casually dismisses your work. Immediately, your mind begins creating arguments. You imagine proving them wrong, correcting them, showing everyone they underestimated you. But before any of those thoughts become words, you quietly ask yourself, does this truly deserve my energy? Sometimes the answer is yes. Constructive feedback deserves attention. Genuine injustice may require action. Clear boundaries sometimes need to be established. But many situations don't require any of those things. They require perspective. Will this matter next month? Next year? 5 years from now? Most of the things that upset us today will become stories we barely remember. The Stoics constantly viewed life from the longest possible perspective. What feels enormous today often becomes insignificant with time. Choosing not to react isn't avoidance. It's wisdom deciding where your energy creates the greatest value. The difference between reaction and response. Many people believe emotional control means suppressing feelings. The Stoics disagreed. They never asked people to become emotionless. Instead, they encouraged people to create space between feeling and action. You might feel disappointed. You might feel frustrated. You might even feel angry. Those emotions are part of being human. But emotions don't have to become decisions. There's a moment, often only a few seconds long, where you still have a choice. That small pause is where freedom lives. Most people never notice it. Stoics train themselves to live inside it. Every time you pause before reacting, you strengthen your character. Eventually, calmness stops being something you force. It becomes part of who you are. Response 7. Thank you for sharing that. This may be the most difficult response of all, not because the words are complicated, because they require enormous humility. Imagine someone points out one of your weaknesses. Your first instinct is probably to explain yourself, to justify your actions, to defend your reputation. But what if, instead, you simply replied, "Thank you for telling me"? At first glance, this feels impossible. Why thank someone for criticizing you? Because criticism often contains information, not always truth, but information. Sometimes it reveals something you've genuinely overlooked. Other times it reveals how people perceive you. Even unfair criticism can teach you something about communication, relationships, or expectations. Marcus Aurelius filled the opening pages of his personal journal by expressing gratitude toward the people who helped shape his character. Some inspired him through kindness. Others challenged him through difficulty. Either way, they became teachers. That perspective changes everything. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What can this teach me?" Those two questions create completely different lives. Every difficult person becomes a teacher. One of the most overlooked ideas in Stoicism is this: your greatest teachers are not always your greatest supporters. Sometimes the person testing your patience is teaching you patience. Sometimes the person questioning your confidence is giving you an opportunity to strengthen it. Sometimes the person trying to provoke your anger is unknowingly helping you master your emotions. That doesn't mean their behavior is acceptable. Boundaries still matter. Respect still matters. Walking away from toxic people is sometimes the wisest decision available. But even difficult people can contribute to your growth if you refuse to let bitterness become your teacher instead. Every challenge becomes training. Every disagreement becomes practice. Every insult becomes another opportunity to prove, not to others, but to yourself, that your character remains intact. The Stoics viewed life this way, not as a series of obstacles, but as a training ground. Just as an athlete grows stronger through resistance, character grows stronger through adversity. Without challenges, patience never develops. Without criticism, humility remains untested. Without conflict, self-control stays theoretical. Life gives us opportunities to practice long before it rewards us with mastery. Many people spend years trying to silence their critics. The Stoics pursued something entirely different. They worked to silence the part of themselves that desperately needed everyone else's approval. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly manage your reputation, trying to make everyone understand you, trying to correct every misunderstanding, trying to respond to every accusation. It's impossible. Someone will always disagree. Someone will always judge. Someone will always misunderstand your intentions. The moment you accept that reality, something remarkable happens. You stop living for applause. You stop fearing criticism. You stop measuring your worth by opinions that change with every passing season. Instead, your confidence begins coming from somewhere far more stable: your own character. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that another person's opinion could never diminish his virtue unless he allowed it to influence his own actions. That lesson remains just as powerful today. People can criticize your work, question your decisions, mock your dreams, misunderstand your intentions. But none of those things determine who you are. Only your choices do. Only your character does. Only your response does. So, the next time someone tries to provoke you, pause before you respond. Ask yourself one simple question: who do I want to become in this moment? Not, how do I win? Not, how do I embarrass them? Not, how do I prove them wrong? But, what kind of person am I choosing to become? Because that's the question that truly matters. Long after the argument is forgotten, long after the criticism disappears, long after people stop talking, your character remains. Guard it carefully, strengthen it daily, and never allow someone else's temporary anger to shape the person you'll become for the rest of your life. If today's message spoke to you, let us know in the comments. Which of these 7 Stoic responses will you begin practicing first? Your answer may encourage someone else who's walking the same path toward greater peace and self-mastery. If you're committed to building an unshakable mind through timeless Stoic wisdom, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more lessons that transform ancient philosophy into practical guidance for everyday life. Until our next journey together, protect your peace, discipline your mind, and remember, the strongest person in the room is rarely the loudest. It's the one who has learned that true power begins with mastering themselves.